All right, let's pray. Lord, thank you for today and for this class. I pray that you'll be with those who are unable to be here tonight, Lord, and I pray that you'll continue to lead us, help us to receive tonight good information, Lord. I pray that you'll teach us. I pray that you'll speak through me. Let this be fruitful in our lives, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen. Let me give you just kind of an interesting thought to start, and then I've got some stuff that we'll hand out. In about 135 AD, right around there, through 130. Anybody know what was going on in Israel during this time? So this is about 100 years after Jesus, right? So Jesus was crucified somewhere, give or take. We don't know exactly what year, but somewhere around year 30 or so. We believe that Jesus most likely was born in 6 BC. The guy that was doing the calculations made a couple errors when he was trying to do the before Christ, and so it's actually Jesus' birth probably was at 6 BC, which would have put him dying probably somewhere around 32 AD, give or take. But so in 130 to 135, any thoughts about what would have been going on in Israel at this point? So there's war going on, and there was an event that happened in AD 70 that's probably much more familiar to most of us, which would be the destruction of the temple, right, that Jesus prophesied, right? So Jesus, right around this time, said within a generation, the temple will be destroyed. And so a generation is typically 40 years. And so, just as he said, right around AD 70, Rome got fed up with Israel. And hey, how's it going? And so Rome got fed up with Israel and sent in the armies to wipe out the temple. And as Jesus said, not one stone would be left on another. And so one day when we teach a temple class, we'll talk about all the research there is about what parts of what is still remaining in Israel are actually temple and what parts were other buildings that were mislabeled. But for our purposes today, I just want us to get this kind of thought in our mind. This is just kind of a devotional just to get us started here. AD 70, the temple is destroyed. There is no centralized place of worship anymore. Not only was the temple destroyed, many things in Jerusalem were destroyed right along with it. But they were not destroyed as a nation at this point. So just the centralized, some of the large buildings in downtown Jerusalem were destroyed, along with several other cities as the army kind of came through. But they allowed them to still be a nation, right? So the temple was kind of seen not just as a religious place, right? But in their world, your political leaders were connected to the temple. So like the Sanhedrin were Pharisees and priests and things, and so the government was really intertwined with the temple. So that's why Rome comes in and destroys the temple. It's not just because they're trying to get rid of the religion of the Jews, but this was the political hub, right? So they're trying to get rid of the politicians, the people that would be leading these revolts, right? So they're just about had it, wipe that out, and then so they expect then that they will hopefully quiet down a little bit. But they didn't. And so they survived as a nation for quite a while longer. But then right in this stretch here, you start seeing people want to revolt again, right? Because Rome is still in charge. They look at the prophecies and they expect that Israel should be a free nation, that God's promised them this land. So they're really not at any point wanting to give up any opportunity to kind of overthrow Rome, right? And so they start to revolt again. And so Rome comes down in, and at this point, the emperor's name is Hadrian. And so Hadrian comes down in, and he's the Roman Caesar at the time, right? And so he comes down, and he says, that's it, I've had enough with these Jewish people. This time, we're going to wipe the whole place out, right? He said, we're done. And so he comes down and just annihilates everybody. In fact, in Revelations, when it says that there would come a time that the blood would be up to the horse's bridle, you know that passage in Revelations? Well, according to a lot of writings from the time, in certain parts of Israel, this took place at this battle. Like they killed so many people that their horses were having a hard time getting through the valleys because of all the blood that had been spilled. They were having to walk through it. And so that prophecy, in many ways, was literally fulfilled right around here. When Israel was no longer a nation anymore. And so we're talking millions of people killed in this battle. Like they decided we're not going to have Jews anymore. And so they tried to kill as many of them as they could. because they kept giving them chances to be a peaceful kind of place. That was Rome's thing, Pax Romana is the idea of peace through war, right? That we expect peace and we will kill you if you don't give it. Kind of mentality is what they based their government on. And so they preferred peace. If you would come peacefully, they always gave people a chance to surrender. But if anybody wouldn't surrender, then they would kill them. And then put somebody else there, and then they would have peace. And so whatever they had to do to attain a peaceful coexistence with the world, they did it. So anyways, Hadrian says, we're done with them, we're tired, wipes them out. This is the point when Israel ceases to be a nation, right? From there all the way until 1948, they were no longer a nation anymore. And then an interesting thing happens. Hadrian says, I'm tired of the Jews being here, so we're going to rename this place, right? And he says, so what we want to do to make it even more egregious to these Jews is we're going to rename it after one of their enemies, so that hopefully they won't ever live here anymore, and we're going to rename this nation of Israel, because it was called Israel back then. He said, we're going to rename it after one of their enemies. And so the traditional enemy at the time, historically for Israel, even though most people probably would have thought in that generation of Rome as being the enemy, but if you look kind of historically, the Philistines were one of Israel's key enemies. And so this Roman leader decides that he wants to name the place after the Philistines instead, so that he will erase not only the Jews who were living there, but perhaps the memory of the Jews as well by renaming the place after one of their enemies. And so he renamed it after the Philistines. And so, of course, it has a Roman twist to it because, he was speaking in Latin, but you call it Palestine, which is just a Roman version of Philistine. And so he renamed this place Palestine. And so it was the renaming of this place and calling it Palestine. It's just a version of the word Philistine, right? Because he wanted to rename this after the Philistines so that there would be no more memory of the Jews anymore. He was tired of fooling with them, right? And so he named it after the Philistines and called it Palestine. And so nobody hardly ever called this the land of Palestine anymore because they knew it was just, something that he called it that. Until, I want to say 1926, a group of people emerged and said that they were Palestinian Arabs and that Palestine was their traditional homeland. Except for the fact that Palestine was just a name of Philistine that he gave this land, and there never was a Palestinian people. This is just the name that he gave the place when he wiped out the Jews. And so a lot of people don't know that, and so they just take that as, oh, Palestinians, man, they've been there forever. Well, there is no such thing as a Palestinian, unless they want to trace their line back to Philistines, but Philistines weren't Arabs. Philistines were from the Greek nations, right? These Philistines were from the islands of Greece that had come down, and so they weren't Arab people at all. So this is just a name that somebody grabbed hold of from history without really understanding what it was. And so I think it's kind of interesting that probably most Americans, a lot of Israeli people know this. I mean, they know that the Palestinians don't really have any kind of traditional hold on the promised land. I mean, it's always been Israel's land unless you're going like way, way back. So anyways, just thought that's kind of an interesting thing that the Palestinians, they claim like they're just some group that's always been there, that Palestine is their homeland, but really Palestine is just a name that was given to it so that people would forget about the Israelites. And there is no Palestinian people, really. I mean, it's the Philistines, but that has nothing to do with the Arabs. And so nobody used this name until about 1926. And then so this group trying to make a land grab from the Israelites was looking for names from history, and they grabbed this and attached it to their group, but there really is no Palestine people, really. I mean, there is now because they call themselves that, but not historically. The Palestinian they grabbed the name with no actual history to back that up, which is ironic because the reason they grabbed the name was because it was from history, and were trying to prove that this had always been their land, except for the fact that the Arabs were never Philistines at any point. Okay, so let me do the video first, and then I'll hand out this. So I have these you can watch at home. This is that Mountain of Fire movie. Did you ever watch this? No? Okay. Where they look for Mount Sinai?
Stupidity, but is it the same thing as a DVD?
Yeah, that is a DVD. So you just pop it in your DVD player. Yeah. And when you watch it, I would watch it at a place when you can kind of focus. I mean, it's not a church service or anything, but to me, it's really a neat experience to see the actual Mount Sinai for the first time. It's kind of a neat thing, and so it's kind of it's a really neat documentary. A lot of times, documentaries, particularly nowadays on the History Channel, where they're just trying to fill time slots, they don't ever find anything. I mean, they have a lot of neat history behind it in the journey, but then when it's all said and done, they don't actually find anything most of the time. Well, this is a true story, and they actually find it, and so it's really neat. And so they've got the video from them and another group later who were there, and so they actually have video of the actual Mount Sinai, and some of the things from Moses' time are still there. So it's really neat, and the Saudi Arabians have this big fence around it, but they don't really know what it is, but they have it protected because they had some military bases in the area, and so it's been protected because they have military bases close. But the people that find it don't think they know exactly what that is that they have there. But it's pretty interesting. So couple of things to know, though, before you watch the movie, right? So I'm going to try here with this. All right. And then, let's see, like this. And then this goes kind of up here, like this. All right, so this is obviously Egypt, right? And I know it's not obvious, but this is Sinai. And then this is Saudi Arabia. Right? So then these two things here would be the two branches of the Red Sea. Okay? And then this is all up here, then being, it's more over this way, but the Promised Land. Right? Okay. So the four areas to focus on: Egypt, right, which would have been where the Israelites were living, right? So there's a couple of spots here. The Nile River comes up here. We talked about the Yotef Canal, and I talked about that in Sunday school. And so that's around this region here, where they created this man-made lake. And then up here, then the Nile branches off into all sorts of tributaries, right? And so it's one main river until it gets about right here, and then it just kind of fans out. And this area here is where many of Jacob's brothers ended up settling. So when Pharaoh said, give them the best of the land, it would have been somewhere up here because there was so much water from the Nile spreading out, right? So this, and then later we know from Egyptian records that when they did have Asiatic slaves, which is what they called Israelites, right? There was no nation of Israel. They called them Asiatics. And so in their writings, that's why you never find anything about Israel being in slavery, because they weren't called Israel yet. They just called them, there was no nation of Israel at that point. These were just people from the area that they called the Asiatics, and they had come and they had settled in here. And so when they had these Asiatic slaves, we have several stories of full-on almost cities in some of these regions that were nothing but Asiatic slaves, which is what you'd expect if you had over 1.5 million or so Israelites living there during the time of Moses, that they would have had to have occupied entire cities worth of them, right? So anyways, out of this region is where the Israelites are starting. The traditional site of Mount Sinai is down here in the Sinai Peninsula, right? This is all mountain range. Through a lot of this is desertous mountains. There's a kind of a path that you could take down here, which is what a lot of people think they took to get to Mount Sinai. And then you've got the Red Sea here. And so knowing that they started here and thinking that this is the traditional site of Mount Sinai, then that would mean then that the crossing would have had to have taken place here at the Red Sea. Now keep in mind the Red Sea has two spots, and so it joins down here and kind of splits into two veins on either side. So it comes up the right side of Sinai Peninsula, it comes up the left side of the Sinai Peninsula. So if you took this as the traditional site, then the route would have had to have been something like this to get down here. And so this has birthed a lot of theories that, oh, they must have crossed way up here where the water's only maybe knee deep and ankle deep in some spots towards the very end up here. And so because they're coming this way and coming down here, some people say, oh, well, they must have crossed up here where it's real shallow, right? Because it wouldn't have made much sense for them to come down in here and then cross the Red Sea. They would have been trying to leave, so they would have come out this way, and then so it kind of leads to these theories that they crossed what is called the Reed Sea. Reed as in R-E-E-D, which is more like just a little boggy swamp, with reeds growing in it that you could walk across. Now the problem with that then is it eliminates the miraculous from the story, because the Bible tells us that it was enough to drown Pharaoh and his armies. And so it's really important to get the crossing site correct. So that's kind of the traditional view. And so this is something called St. Catherine's. There's a monastery built on the top of the mountain there. Tons of people go there every year. The trouble is that in Galatians, Paul says, when he's giving the explanation of one of his metaphors, where he's talking about Sarah and Hagar, right? And he gives an example of them, and he says that those two people metaphorically represent the two mountains, right? And one of the mountains that he's talking about in the story that he's telling in Galatians is Mount Sinai. And he throws a comment in there, and he says, and we know Mount Sinai is in Arabia, right? And so Arabia is this area over here, right? We call it Saudi Arabia. They just called it Arabia, but that is this area over here, right? And so Paul says clearly that the mountain of God is over here, not here. Which really makes a lot of sense, too, because this Sinai Peninsula is Egypt's land, and it's basically always been Egypt's land. And so if all they did was go here, they never left Egypt to begin with, right? Because this Sinai Peninsula was the mining district for Egypt, right? And so this is where they got much of their stone. This is where they got a lot of minerals and things that they would bring back then to these areas. And so Egypt kept a tight hold on this. Egypt's military was all through this area. In fact, they had built up many checkpoints and military places. It was almost like a wall in some areas through here that had been set up. The Bible doesn't talk about that, but we know historically that was there. And so that might explain why they felt like they had to ask permission to leave. Not only the fact that they're slaves, but because Egypt had built a wall system here to keep people out. And the reason that they did that, and it would obviously keep people in too if they were in there, but the reason that they did that, you can go all the way back to like the stories of Abraham, that whenever a famine hit, what did all these people up here, what was the first thing they thought of when a famine hit? Well, let's go down to Egypt, right? Because Egypt's going to have some food, because the Nile River is there, and they're going to have some food. And so historically, the story of Abraham was not just Abraham's story. All these people from this area we know, anytime there was a famine, they would flood down into Egypt because Egypt always had food. Well, the Egyptians didn't want these people in their land. And so after a few famines or so, Pharaoh started building military establishments all across this part here to keep people from coming in during times of famine. And so, but those same military outposts here would have kept the Israelites in. And so that's probably another big part of why they had to ask permission, was because they wouldn't have been let past the wall without Pharaoh's permission, right? And so Saudi Arabia is over here, and interestingly enough, there's a mountain here called Jebel el-Lawz. Jebel el-Lawz, and that is the mountain in question here that is on the movie. And so the idea being that the Israelites are coming over this way, and so they would have crossed this Red Sea, not this one, right? This part of the Red Sea. The Red Sea splits in half, and so it's this part of the Red Sea, because all of this was Egypt anyways, right? And so we're talking about them coming out. Now, Paul says that we know it was in Arabia, so they begin the journey of looking for it in Arabia. And in fact, they got lost in the middle of the place, and the way that they found it is they asked a nomad, and they asked him if he knew anything about Moses. And he said, oh, I know where the mountain of Moses is. And he pointed them here, because they kind of got lost in the desert. And he said, oh, no, we know where the mountain of Moses is. And then, so they take them there to that. The reason that I put all this on here, I'm not trying to spoil the movie for you, but I think they find the mountain, but they don't have the crossing point correct of crossing the Red Sea, because they know they're coming here, right, to Jebel al-Oz, which is in Saudi Arabia. And so they kind of took this same route and then thought maybe that they crossed over here somewhere, right? So everything about the mountain in this movie is absolutely correct, right? Where they find it, they show it to you. It's amazing. The whole thing is burnt with fire. The whole mountain is burnt with fire. Just like the Bible said, that God descended on in a fire. You can pick up the rocks, and the other side is not burnt. And so the entire mountain is burnt, and it's still there today. And there's a lot of things from that where the Bible says that Moses was supposed to build an altar at a certain spot at the base of the mountain. Well, if you go to that base of the mountain, it's there still. It's all knocked over on its side, but it's still there. The altar of the golden calf is still sitting there, and it's there. So the golden calf part is gone, but the altar itself that they did it on is still there. It's huge. It's bigger than this room. It's massive. The rock that Moses split for the water to come out of is there, and it's huge. It's like a 4-story building. It's impressive. And so that's all on there. All that part is correct. It is the crossing point where they were kind of unsure of, and so later people have come in and found the actual crossing point, which means what the Israelites did, which makes sense to me because you could just walk across this way. If you're coming out of Egypt and you want to go to Saudi Arabia, there's like this is all land up here, like the Red Sea comes and stops, and this is all land, the Promised Land and everything. You can walk from here to Saudi Arabia without having to cross the Red Sea. I mean, people go to Saudi Arabia all the time from Egypt, and nobody has to wait on God to part the Red Sea, And so Moses knows the way. Moses has made this trip a couple of times now, right? Moses is left from Egypt to go to Saudi Arabia the first time, which that's the other key, is Midian, where Moses lived. That is traditionally old Saudi Arabia, right? And so when he went to go live with the Midianites, that's nothing here. That's the Saudi Arabian Arab tribes that were over here. That was Midian. And so the Bible says he comes over here. So he would have known how to get there. He wouldn't have done something so stupid as to come down here where the only way to get back to Arabia is to have God part the Red Sea, because he wasn't even thinking along those lines when they left, right? So they wouldn't have come down this way to get to Saudi Arabia. They would have come across the north, which makes sense because then when you get up here, God said, don't turn north, because the Promised Land's right there. God said, don't turn north and go into the Promised Land because the Philistines are there and they're going to want to fight you. And that's where the Philistine land is right here on the bottom west left side of the Promised Land. And so God has them coming across this way, and they're on their way. The very direct route is just to come right here. And an interesting thing happens is when they get about right here, God tells Moses to stop, right? And they stop the camp. And God says, I want you to turn off. And this is in Exodus. He says, I want you to turn off the road, and I want you to go a way that I will show you, right? Because Moses would have had to have had in his mind, let's just go the direct route and come down, right? Nobody's thinking, let's go to a place where the only way to get across is a miracle. You're just going to go the normal way because you got all these people. You got 2 million people walking behind you. You need to go to an easy route as possible, right? So he has him get off and go and follow a road down here. And there's a place here. And so I had the benefit of knowing some researchers, some people that found the actual, they went diving in here, and I've got some pictures I'll show you, and they found the actual crossing site because Pharaoh's chariots and things are still there. And so they were able to find this area. And so what I did was I knew where they were when they stopped, and so I pulled up like you've got MapQuest and things like that now that like Google Earth and stuff where you can go to any place in the world and zoom in on the land. And so there's a road that comes right here and connects this through the mountains, right? From here to this spot here. And what this is it's like a cul-de-sac. So think when you're looking at the this road that connects it from up here, it's going through an area. Have you ever been to the Grand Canyon? You've seen pictures of the Grand Canyon, how vertical the walls are. Well, the Grand Canyon is very wide in the valleys and vertical, but these mountains are not wide in the valley part, but they are very vertical, right? So think something maybe 100 to 150 feet wide, like as wide as this building, but then when you hit the wall, it's going straight up, like a, you know, like a giant canyon. Like there's no way to climb up that, right? So when you're in between these two vertical things of the mountain, it's kind of like the Grand Canyon, just not quite as wide, right? So when you're in there, there's no real way to climb out, right? And so they get on this road and they're coming down to the end of this, and there's no way to go to the left or to the right because it's vertical mountain cliffs all the way up. And they come to this point, and it's a cul-de-sac, and this is actually like a beach at like a half moon crescent kind of beach, and this is all vertical mountain area here. So they get here on the road. You can't go to the left, you can't go to the right. The only way to get in and out is following this narrow road. And then they get word that Pharaoh's army is on the road also, right? And that's when panic sets in, because they know they can't just climb out of the valley area. It's too steep. They can't go backwards because Pharaoh's army is in the road too now. And so the only place to go is forward. And as soon as they get forward, it dead ends into the Red Sea and they're stuck, right? And so this is where the story takes place. And then if you dive right across from this beach, many chariots are still there in the water today, which is kind of interesting. And so what you'll find is that where the chariots were, some of the wood has eroded, right? But through time, barnacles attach themselves and coral to the wood, right? And so these barnacles attach themselves, and through time, a lot of the wood from the chariots has disappeared, but it's left a coral formation that looks just like a chariot wheel where the coral had attached itself in times past to the chariot wheels. And so they actually found, they weren't able to pull it out of the water, but they actually found one of the golden chariot wheels from Pharaoh's chariot. And so that picture at the top is the golden chariot from Pharaoh's chariot.
Really gold?
It's pure gold.
Mm-hmm.